Sindbad the Sailor, Part 3. In English. Once there lived a poor porter Sindbad who came across a lovely mansion and envied its master. Sindbad the sailor, who was the master of the mansion, inquired about his envy and offered him wine and food to eat. Then Sindbad narrated his story, 7 voyages, of how he became rich to the porters and others who were at his mansion. Sindbad was too restless living a life of ease, or perhaps was too greedy for yet more gold. He thought that wealth doesn't only bring luxurious life, but also respect from his friends and family. Sindbad was not content. He wanted as much gold as he could get. Swan his Rashnash stared his voyage seas once more. Sindbad joined a ship of merchants and travel. During his voyage a gale blew up and tossed their boat here and there. When the storm settled, Sindbad and some of his crew members found themselves on an island shore. Sindbad and the others were shocked to see tribes of apes carrying spears and making mischief on land and sea. The apes wrecked their ship, but they dared not to fight them as the apes were too numerous. They hurried from there and landed on another island. While resting, they were woken by a minor earthquake. The ground trembled. It was a monster of a man, as tall and broad as a tree, with one eye. His teeth were like boar's tusks, his nails like lion claws, and his mouth gaped like a well. The one-eyed giant examined us one by one to see who had enough fat. The captain was the fattest and gulped by the giant. After satisfying his stomach, the monster lay down and fell asleep. Sindbad and others planned to escape. They started to repair their ship. The monster woke up with a terrible roar and chased them. They managed to escape from that island and landed safely on the other. Once they reached the shore, they were able to find fresh water and fruit, but soon danger found them. Enormous snakes dropped down from a tree and charged towards them. Sindbad and others attacked the snake with knives and rocks, but no use. Still more giant snakes were out of the bushes. They ran from there and decided to build a shelter. They began to cut down branches from the tree and build a kind of cage around them, and managed to get some rest for the night. In the morning, they all walked towards their ship. Inside the wooden cage they discarded the cage. When they reached the shore, they saw the sail of another ship and shouted for help. The captain of the ship rescued them safely. Sindbad returned to Baghdad with so much wealth that he shared with the poor.
Once upon a time, there lived an ant and a grasshopper in a grassy meadow by the river. It was during the hot summer season, when the ant was toiling hard by collecting wheat grains from the farmer's field. The ant would work hard all day long from dawn to dusk, collecting the heavy grain well balanced on her back. She would then put the wheat grain in her larder carefully and rush back to the field to collect another grain. She would scurry back and forth between the field and her larder, often doing this task the whole day. On the other hand, there was a grasshopper in the grassy meadow who would spend all his time in singing and dancing. He would often scorn at the ant for toiling so hard the entire day in collecting the grains. He would frequently call the ant to join him in singing, dancing, and making merry of the present time. However, the ant would ignore him and continue with her work. This would make the grasshopper laugh even louder, and he would often ridicule the ant, stating that they have enough food to sustain themselves in summer. Hearing this, the ant said that she was saving some food for the cold season and recommended the grasshopper to follow the same. The grasshopper didn't pay heed to her words and continued singing and dancing merrily. Soon summer faded to autumn and autumn to winter. It became freezing cold outside due to snowfall, and the sun was barely visible and the nights were long and dark. Out of cold, the grasshopper lost his interest in singing and making merry. He was cold and hungry and had no place to take shelter from the snow outside. He wondered how to save himself from this tough situation. Suddenly he remembered about the ant and visited her for some food and shelter. Off he went to her place and knocked at her door for help. When she opened the door, the grasshopper offered to sing for her in return for some food and shelter. To this, the ant replied that she had toiled hard in summer to save enough food for winter, and the grasshopper had mocked her then. She gently asked him to sing somewhere else and earn his food and shelter. It is then the grasshopper realized that he should have saved up enough for the winter instead of wasting his time being lazy during summer and singing and dancing around. Moral of the story: make hay while the sun shines.
Once upon a time there was an old pig with 3 little pigs, And one day she said to them, "My children, it is time for you to go out in the world and seek your fortunes." So, bidding their mother goodbye, the three little pigs set out to earn their living. The first little pig, whose name was Whitey, met a man with a bundle of straw and said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me that straw to build a house with?" The man gave Whitey the straw, and he built himself a house with it. Presently a wolf came along and knocked at the door of Whitey's house. Little pig," he said. "Let me come in." But of course Whitey didn't want the wolf to come in, so he said, "No, no, by the hair on my chinny chin." This made the wolf angry, and he said, "Then I'll puff and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he puffed and he huffed and he blew the house in. And he carried poor little Whitey away to his home in the forest. The second little pig, whose name was Blackie, met a man carrying some wood, and he said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me that wood to build a house with?" The man gave Blackie the wood and he built himself a house with it. But along came the wolf and knocked at the door of Blackie's house. Little pig," he said. "Let me come in." "No, no," replied Blackie in great fright. "Not by the hair on my chinny chin." "Then I'll puff and I'll huff and I'll blow your house in." So the wolf puffed and he huffed and at last he blew the house in. And away he went with Blackie to his home in the forest. Now the third little pig, whose name was Brownie, met a man with a load of bricks and he said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me those bricks to build a house with?" The man gave him the bricks, and Brownie built himself a very snug little house with them. He had just finished his house when the wolf came along. Little pig," he said. "Let me come in." "No, no, by the hair on my chinny chin." "Then I'll puff and I'll huff and I'll blow your house in." But though the wolf puffed and he huffed, and he huffed and he puffed, he could not blow down Brownie's house made of bricks. So he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice field of turnips." "Where?" asked Brownie. "Over in Mr. Smith's field. If you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you and we will go together and get some for dinner." "Very well," answered Brownie. "I will be ready. What time do you want to go?" "Around 6 o'clock," answered the wolf. Got up at 5 o'clock and went out and got the turnips and was back home before the wolf came at 6 o'clock. When the wolf found that Brownie had been to Mr. Smith's field before him, he was very angry, and wondered how he could catch him. So he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice apple orchard." "Where?" asked Brownie. "Down at Mary Garden," replied the wolf. "I will go with you tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock and we will get some apples." But Brownie hustled and bustled around, and went the next morning at 4 o'clock to the apple orchard. This time he had farther to go and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was getting down with the apples in a basket, he saw the wolf coming. Of course he was frightened. When the wolf came up to the tree, he said to Brownie, "Ah, I see you are here before me. Are they very nice apples?" "Yes, indeed," replied Brownie. "Here, I will throw one down to you." And he threw the apple so far that while the wolf was running to pick it up, the little pig jumped down from the tree and ran home. Now the wolf was very, very angry, and he thought and finally thought of a plan to catch the little pig. Coming to his house the next morning, he said, "Little pig, there is a fair in town this afternoon. Will you go?" "Oh, yes," replied Brownie. "I will be very glad to go. What time will you want me to be ready?" "At 3 o'clock," said the wolf. But Brownie went off to the fair at 1 o'clock and bought a great big copper kettle. Alas! On the way home with the kettle, he saw the wolf coming up the hill. Poor little Brownie! He didn't know what to do. And then suddenly he jumped into the copper kettle and gave himself a push. And the kettle went rolling over and over, with the little pig in it. When the wolf saw the kettle coming rolling toward him, he was so frightened that he turned and ran back home without going to the fair. The next day he stopped at the little pig's house and told him how frightened he had been by a great, shining thing that had rolled down the hill toward him. Then Brownie laughed, and said to the wolf, "Ha! I frightened you, Mr. Wolf. I had been to the fair and bought a copper kettle, and when I saw you coming I got into it and rolled down the hill." This made the wolf so very angry that he jumped up onto the roof of the little pig's house and started to climb down the chimney. When Brownie saw this, he made a blazing fire in the fireplace and hung the copper kettle over it full of scalding water. And just as the wolf came down the chimney, the little pig pulled off the cover of the kettle and plop! Into the scalding water fell the wolf. So Brownie boiled the wolf, and then went out and rescued his two brothers, Whitey and Blackie, from the forest where the wolf had been keeping them. And they all lived happily together in the little brick house forever afterwards.
Subscribe the channel. The Ugly Duckling. It was a warm summer day. A mother duck had her nest hidden in the long grass, safe from weasels and the fox. She sat on her eggs, waiting for the eggs to hatch. Finally, the eggs hatched, with a pop and peep. Peep. A bunch of golden ducklings appeared. The mother duck was so happy to see her ducklings. But the largest egg in the nest was still there. The mother duck didn't remember laying such a huge egg. Suddenly the large egg cracked open. The baby bird was big, gray and ugly. He had huge feet and a broad beak and didn't look like a duckling. Other ducklings don't like him as he was ugly. A few days later the mother duck took her ducklings for a swim. The big gray duckling also joined other ducklings. After a great swim, the duck family walked with slow steps, on their way to the yard. As the gray duckling entered the yard, all the birds started talking about him. Every day he was pecked and pushed by ducks and even by the chickens. One day the poor ugly duckling couldn't take it anymore, so he ran far away from his home. At last, he ended up in a swamp where only wild ducks live. The wild ducks told him, "You're an ugly fellow, you cannot stay here, go away." The duckling moved away from those ducks. The poor duckling felt very lonely. He didn't even move from that place. As it was winter, the water was so cold, and he got stuck in the swamp as it froze. In the morning a farmer who came that way rescued the duckling and took him to his house. But the duckling was terrified. He fluttered into the milk vessel and splashed it all over the room. The farmer's wife got furious and chased him out into cold. The duckling went back to the swamp. He spent a long and lonely winter, struggling to survive. At last, the snow melted away. It was spring and the duckling was big and stronger than before. He flew high in the air, and he landed by a lovely lake surrounded by magnificent, white and graceful swans. The ugly duckling thought that if the swans see him they will also make fun of his appearance. He was ashamed of himself and bowed his head low. When he bent his head, he saw his reflection in the water and was astonished. His ugly feathers were now snowy white. His neck was curved and slender. He had grown into a swan. The other swans came towards him and stroked him with their beaks. Nearby children shouted with joy at the sight of him and threw him some breadcrumbs. He felt very happy to be with his friends. Thanks for watching. The Lazy Donkey. A salt merchant lived in a small village. Every day, he walked to the city to buy salt. His donkey accompanied him. The merchant loaded the bags of salt on the donkey, and they walked back to the village along the river. But the donkey did not like to carry so many bags on his back as he was lazy. The donkey always looked for ways to get rid of work. One day, the salt merchant loaded the donkey with 2 bags of salt, and they started walking back to the village. On the way, the donkey accidentally slipped into the river. The salt dissolved in the water, and when the donkey was pulled out of the river, he felt lighter. The salt merchant had to go back to the city to buy more salt. The donkey thought of this as a good idea to get rid of the load. The next day, the donkey intentionally slips into the river. When he was pulled out, he felt lighter. The salt merchant understood the donkey trick. He knew that donkey was falling in the river on purpose. So, one day the salt merchant filled the bag with cotton instead of salt. The donkey felt that the bags were much lighter than previous days, but the donkey wished to reduce the weight even more. So the donkey again fell into the river. But when he was pulled out, the load on his back felt much heavier. As the bag contained cotton, when it fell into the water along with the donkey, the cotton absorbed the water and the bag became heavier. The donkey had to pick up the heavier load. It realized his mistake and understood that the same measures will not suit all circumstances. He had learned his lesson. Moral of the story, you can fool a person a few times but not always. Those who are too clever sometimes overreach themselves and get trapped at their own risk. Thanks for watching. There was a dog that was very hungry. He searched for food everywhere and at last he found a bone. He picked the bone with his mouth and started going back to his home. There was a bridge on the way to his home. When he started crossing it, he saw his reflection in the water. The dog thought that there was another dog with a bone in water. He wanted to get that other bone too. So he started barking at his own reflection. His bone fell in water as soon as he opened his mouth. The greedy dog lost his bone. Thanks for watching.